The town of Bitter Creek had gathered under the burning noon sun, their eyes fixed on the wooden gallows standing tall in the dusty square. A rope swayed gently in the dry wind, waiting for its victim. At the center of it all stood Marlo Thorne, a young woman with wrists bound, her face pale but defiant. The sheriff read out her sentence. For the crime of theft and murder, the accused shall hang by the neck until dead. But whispers rippled through the crowd. Folks knew Marlo wasn't guilty. The evidence had been thin, the trial rushed, and the judge, Judge Calder, a man with a reputation for pocketing bribes, hadn't even let her speak in her own defense. The marshal wasn't in town, the deputies looked uneasy, and the sheriff's eyes betrayed doubt. Yet the noose was ready, and then, just as the hangman reached for the lever, a staggering figure pushed through the crowd. His hat was crooked, his boots caked in mud, and the smell of whiskey clung to him like smoke. It was Caleb McKenzie, a cowboy known more for his drinking than his gun. Folks laughed when they saw him stumble forward, until he raised his voice, loud and cracked, cutting through the silence. "Hold it right there! That girl ain't dying today." The crowd gasped. The sheriff froze, and Judge Calder's face darkened like a storm. The crowd erupted in nervous laughter when Caleb McKenzie stumbled forward, his boots dragging through the dirt like he could barely stand. Mothers pulled their children closer, men muttered about "that useless drunk," and Judge Calder sneered from his high chair on the platform. "Marshal ain't here, Sheriff," Calder barked, his voice sharp as a whip. "Clear this fool out before he makes a mockery of the law." But Caleb didn't move aside. He swayed, yes, but his eyes, bloodshot though they were, locked on Marlo Thorne. And for the first time in weeks, there was something steady in his gaze. "Mockery?" Caleb slurred, his words dragging but loud enough for all to hear. "The only mockery here is calling this justice. That girl's innocent, and you know it." The sheriff hesitated. His hand hovered near his revolver, but he didn't draw. The deputies shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. The townsfolk, who had come expecting a quick hanging, now leaned in, curious. Caleb took another step forward, nearly tripping, but caught himself on the gallows post. He pointed a shaky finger at Judge Calder. "You rushed her trial. You silenced her defense. And you—" He jabbed the air, his voice rising with sudden fire. "You buried the truth, same way you've buried every man or woman who stood in your way." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Calder's face flushed red, his jaw tightening. "Sheriff," the judge thundered, "remove him or I'll have you in contempt." But Caleb wasn't finished. He reached into his coat, and for a moment the crowd thought he was going for his gun. Hands twitched toward holsters. The deputy stiffened. Instead, Caleb pulled out a crumpled, dirt-stained letter. He held it high, his hand trembling. "This here," he shouted, "is proof Marlo Thorne didn't kill that rancher. Proof that the judge himself had reason to see her swing." The square fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Caleb's voice dropped low, almost a growl. "You hang her today, and Bitter Creek will remember it wasn't justice. It was murder." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. The deputies froze. And Judge Calder, for the first time, looked rattled. The hangman's hand hovered over the lever, uncertain. The crowd, once eager for blood, now buzzed with suspicion. And Marlo Thorne, standing with the noose around her neck, lifted her head. For the first time since her arrest, hope flickered in her eyes. The square of Bitter Creek had never been so quiet. Even the horses tied to the rails seemed to sense the weight of the moment, stamping nervously, ears twitching. Caleb McKenzie stood at the foot of the gallows, swaying slightly, the crumpled letter still raised in his hand. Judge Calder's voice cut through the silence, sharp and venomous. "Sheriff, I gave you an order. Remove this man before he poisons the minds of these good people with his drunken lies." But the sheriff didn't move. His jaw worked as though he were chewing on a stone, his eyes flicking between Caleb, the letter, and the girl with the noose around her neck. He had worn the badge long enough to know when something stank of corruption. Caleb's voice, though rough and slurred, carried a strange conviction. "You all know me," he said, turning to the crowd. "You know I've wasted more nights in the saloon than I care to count. But I ain't so drunk I can't see the truth. This girl's no killer. She's being used to cover up a crime that runs deeper than any of you realize." The townsfolk shifted uneasily. A rancher in the front row spat into the dirt. "What proof you got, McKenzie?" "You're just a drunk with a piece of paper." Caleb unfolded the letter with trembling hands. The paper was torn, smudged with dirt, but the ink was still legible. He read aloud, his voice cracking but steady enough. "Judge Calder, payment delivered as agreed. The rancher's land will be signed over once the girl is convicted. No witnesses remain. Burn this letter." A murmur swept through the crowd like a prairie fire. Heads turned toward the judge, whose face had gone pale beneath his powdered wig. "That's a forgery," Calder barked, slamming his fist on the arm of his chair. "A desperate trick from a worthless drunk." But Caleb wasn't finished. He stuffed the letter back into his coat and stepped closer to the gallows, his boots dragging through the dust. His hand brushed the butt of his revolver, though he didn't draw. "You can call me worthless, Judge," he said, his voice low and dangerous now. "But you can't call me blind. That rancher, Elias Porter, he didn't die by this girl's hand. He died because he wouldn't sell his land. And you—" Caleb jabbed a finger at Calder again, his whole body trembling with fury. "You made sure the blame fell on someone too poor to fight back." The crowd erupted. Some shouted in agreement, others in disbelief. The deputies looked to the sheriff, waiting for his command. The hangman stepped back from the lever, sweat dripping down his brow. Marlo Thorne, still bound, whispered hoarsely, "It's true. I tried to tell them." Her voice cracked, but the crowd heard it. The sheriff finally spoke, his voice heavy with conflict. "Judge Calder, if what this man says is true, then this execution can't go forward." "Not until we know the truth." Calder shot to his feet, his face twisted with rage. "You dare question me? I am the law in Bitter Creek." And in that instant, Caleb McKenzie did something no one expected. He straightened his back, his drunken sway gone, his eyes clear as a hawk's. He drew his revolver, not to fire but to hold it steady at his side, the sun glinting off the steel. "Not today, Judge," he said, his voice calm now, almost sober. "Today the law answers to the truth." The square exploded into chaos. Shouts, boots scuffling, hands reaching for guns. The air was thick with the promise of blood. And at the center of it all stood Caleb McKenzie, the drunk cowboy who had just turned a hanging into a standoff. The square of Bitter Creek had turned into a powder keg, and Caleb McKenzie was the spark. His revolver gleamed in the sun, steady in his hand, though everyone knew he'd been drunk not 10 minutes ago. Now he looked like a man reborn, sobered by purpose, driven by something stronger than whiskey. Judge Calder's voice thundered over the crowd. "Sheriff, "Deputies, arrest this man before he drags us all into ruin!" But the sheriff didn't move. His hand hovered near his holster, his eyes locked on Caleb. The deputies shifted uneasily, sweat dripping down their temples. They weren't sure who to obey, the judge who paid their wages or the cowboy who had just lit a fire in the hearts of the townsfolk. The people of Bitter Creek were no longer silent. Murmurs turned to shouts. "Let the girls speak! Show us the letter again! Calder's been crooked for years." The judge slammed his fist on the railing of the platform. His face was red, his voice shrill with rage. "You fools! You'll hang for this insubordination. The law is mine to command." Caleb raised his voice, cutting through the chaos. "No, Judge. The law belongs to the people, and today the people are watching." He turned to the crowd, his voice carrying a strange, commanding weight. "You all know Elias Porter. You know he wouldn't sell his ranch, not for all the gold in the territory. And now he's dead, and this girl's about to swing for it. Ask yourselves, who profits from that land? Who's been buying up every acre from here to the Bitter Ridge?" The crowd's eyes shifted slowly back to Judge Calder. The judge's lips curled into a sneer. "You think you can sway them with drunken ramblings? You're nothing but a washed-up cowhand with a pistol and a piece of paper." Caleb's revolver twitched upward, not aimed at Calder, but at the rope above Marlo's head. "Maybe so," he said, his voice low and steady, "but I'll be damned if I let an innocent girl die while the real killer sits in judgment." The hangman froze, his hand still on the lever. The sheriff finally spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of years. "Judge, if there's truth to this letter, then this execution can't go forward." "Not today." Calder's face twisted with fury. He reached into his robes, pulling out a small Derringer pistol, his hand shaking with rage. "You'll regret this, Sheriff. You'll all regret this." Gasps tore through the crowd. Mothers screamed. Men reached for their guns. And in that instant, Caleb McKenzie stepped forward, his revolver snapping up like lightning. The crowd held its breath, the world narrowing to two men, the drunk cowboy who had found his courage, and the judge who had ruled Bitter Creek with an iron fist. The silence was so sharp it hurt. Dust swirled in the air, the noose swayed gently in the wind, and every soul in Bitter Creek knew that the next heartbeat would decide whether justice lived or died. The square of Bitter Creek held its breath. Caleb McKenzie's revolver gleamed steady in his hand, while Judge Calder's Derringer trembled in his. The crowd, once eager for spectacle, now stood frozen between fear and fury. Then it happened. A single crack split the air. Calder fired first. The Derringer's shot went wide, splintering the wood of the gallows post inches from Marlo's head. She flinched, the noose tightening against her throat. Caleb's gun barked in reply, the sound rolling like thunder across the square. His bullet struck true, not Calder, but the Derringer itself, shattering it from the judge's hand. The little pistol clattered to the platform, useless. The crowd erupted. Some cheered, others screamed. Mothers pulled their children away. Men ducked behind barrels, and the deputies finally drew their weapons. "Hold your fire!" the sheriff roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. But it was too late. One deputy, loyal to Calder, raised his rifle and aimed at Caleb. Caleb spun, quicker than anyone thought a drunk could move. His revolver cracked again, and the deputy's hat flew from his head as the bullet grazed his ear. The man dropped his rifle and stumbled back, clutching his bleeding face. The other deputy hesitated, torn between orders and conscience. His gun wavered, then lowered. The crowd saw it, and their voices rose in a wave of anger. "Let the girl go! Down with Calder! Justice for Marlo!" Judge Calder, pale and sweating, scrambled backward on the platform like a cornered rat. His voice cracked with desperation. "You fools! You'll hang for this, every last one of you." Caleb advanced, his revolver still steady, his boots crunching in the dust. "No, Judge," he said, his voice low but carrying. "The only one swinging today is the man who's been hanging this town by the neck for years." The sheriff stepped forward, his hand finally leaving his holster. He looked at Caleb, then at the girl still bound beneath the noose. His face was carved with conflict, but his voice was firm. "Cut her down!" The hangman froze. "Sheriff, I said cut her down." The hangman obeyed, fumbling with the rope until Marlo Thorne stumbled free, her wrists still bound, but her neck spared. The crowd roared, some rushing forward to shield her, others shouting for Calder's arrest. The judge's face twisted with rage and fear. He lunged for the fallen derringer, but Caleb was faster. His boot came down hard, pinning the weapon to the platform. He leaned close, his revolver inches from Calder's chest. "You've ruled Bitter Creek with fear long enough," Caleb growled. "But fear don't last forever." "Truth does." The sheriff climbed the steps of the gallows, his badge glinting in the sun. He looked at Calder, then at the crowd, then back at Caleb. "Judge Calder," he said, his voice heavy, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and the murder of Elias Porter." The square exploded again, this time not in chaos but in triumph. The people of Bitter Creek shouted, cheered, and stamped their boots in the dust. For the first time in years, they felt the weight of Calder's grip begin to lift. But Caleb McKenzie didn't smile. His revolver lowered, his shoulders sagged, and the whiskey on his breath seemed to return. He looked at Marlo, her eyes wide with gratitude, and then at the sheriff, who now held the judge in custody. The cowboy muttered, almost to himself, "Justice ain't clean. It's bloody, it's messy, but sometimes it's all a man's got left." And as the crowd carried Marlo away from the gallows, Bitter Creek knew the day wasn't over. The judge's arrest was only the beginning. The truth still had to be proven, and the danger was far from gone. The square of Bitter Creek was still ringing with the echoes of gunfire. Smoke hung in the air, curling lazily in the late afternoon sun. The crowd, once a restless mob, now stood in stunned silence, their eyes darting between the bound girl, the fallen judge, and the cowboy who had just changed everything. Caleb McKenzie lowered his revolver at last. His hand trembled, not from drink this time, but from the weight of what he had done. He holstered the weapon slowly, his eyes never leaving Judge Calder, who now sat slumped on the gallows platform, his fine robes torn, his face pale with fury and fear. The sheriff stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. He pulled a pair of iron shackles from his belt and snapped them around Calder's wrists. The sound of the metal closing was like a church bell tolling, the end of an era. "You'll answer for this, Judge," the sheriff said, his voice grim. "Not in your own court, but in front of the people you've been bleeding dry." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Caleb didn't join them. His eyes drifted to Marlo Thorne, who was being helped down from the gallows by two townsfolk. Her wrists were still bound, her face streaked with dust and tears, but her chin was high. She looked at Caleb, and for a moment their eyes locked. Gratitude shone there, but also something else, fear, because she knew, as Caleb did, that this wasn't over. The letter in Caleb's coat pocket burned like a brand against his chest. It was proof, yes. But proof of what? That Calder had taken bribes? That Elias Porter had been murdered for his land? It was enough to stir the town, but not enough to topple the men who stood behind Calder. And Caleb knew there were men behind him. He turned to the sheriff, his voice low. You think Calder acted alone? You think a judge with a taste for whiskey and gold had the power to pull this off by himself? The sheriff's jaw tightened. He didn't answer, but his silence said enough. Caleb spat into the dust. Porter's land sits on the Bitter Ridge. Rich soil, water rights, maybe even silver in them hills. Calder was just the front man. Someone else is pulling the strings. The sheriff nodded reluctantly. I reckon you're right. But calling out Calder in front of the whole town, that was dangerous. Whoever's behind this won't take kindly to you exposing their man. Caleb gave a humorless chuckle. Ain't the first time I've made enemies. Won't be the last. The crowd was dispersing now, buzzing with excitement, fear, and speculation. Some slapped Caleb on the back, calling him a hero. Others muttered that he was still just a drunk who'd gotten lucky. But Caleb didn't care. He wasn't listening to them. He was listening to Marlo. She had pushed through the crowd, her wrists finally cut free, and now she stood before him. Her voice was hoarse but steady. You saved my life, Mr. McKenzie. But you've painted a target on your back. Calder wasn't the only one who wanted me dead. Caleb studied her, his eyes narrowing. Then you know more than you let on. Marlo hesitated, glancing around at the thinning crowd. Then she leaned closer, her words barely above a whisper. Elias Porter didn't just refuse to sell his land. He found something on it, something men would kill for. That's why they framed me. That's why they silenced him. Caleb's stomach tightened. He thought of the letter, of Calder's desperation, of the way the deputies had hesitated to act. This was bigger than one crooked judge. The sheriff joined them, his face grim. If that's true, then Bitter Creek's in more danger than we thought. Calder's arrest won't stop this. It'll just stir the hornet's nest. Caleb looked out over the town, the dusty streets, the wooden storefronts, the people who had lived too long under Calder's shadow. He thought of the bottle waiting for him back at the saloon, the easy escape of whiskey. But then he looked at Marlo, alive because he had stood up when no one else would. For the first time in years, Caleb felt something stir in his chest. Not pride, not hope, responsibility. He muttered almost to himself, Guess a drunk cowboy's got more riding to do. The sheriff gave him a long look. You sure you're up for this, McKenzie? You've already made yourself a marked man. Caleb's hand brushed the revolver at his side. His eyes were tired but steady. Marked men don't live long, but sometimes they live long enough to set things right. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across Bitter Creek. The gallows still stood, empty now, but its shadow stretched across the square like a warning. And in that shadow, Caleb McKenzie knew the fight for justice had only just begun. The gallows stood empty, the crowd dispersed, and Judge Calder was led away in irons. Bitter Creek breathed easier, though the shadow of corruption still lingered on the horizon. Marlo Thorne, free at last, placed a hand on Caleb's arm. You saved me, and maybe this whole town. Caleb shook his head, his eyes tired but steady. I just stopped one rope from tightening. The real fight's still out there. The sheriff nodded, knowing the cowboy was right. Calder had been only a piece of something larger. And the truth would demand more than one day's courage. Caleb tipped his hat, the whiskey-stained brim low over his eyes. I ain't no hero, just a man who finally sobered up long enough to do what's right. With that, he turned and walked into the setting sun, his boots stirring the dust, leaving Bitter Creek behind. The town would remember the day a drunk cowboy stopped an execution and how in doing so, he gave them back their faith in justice. And though Caleb McKenzie rode away alone, his name would ride with them forever.